All right, so we're partway in. Let's get started. Welcome everyone to our Leger webinar on Reputation Matters. I am I am here today to talk with Alan. Actually, I'm going to let Alan talk, and I'm going to field some questions you have at the end. So, Dr. Middleton, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to read you what ChatGPT has suggested that I say as an intro. He has dedicated his professional life to the study and practice of marketing, making significant contributions through both academic research and practical application. His work has not only shaped the thinking of countless professionals and students alike, but has also led to innovative strategies that have transformed businesses around the globe. So I think that's a fairly fair. Alan said keep the intro brief, but I'm going to expand on that. We've known Alan has been part of Leger's academic committee for more than a decade. He has advised us and made changes, have helped Leger adjust and make changes and grow and learn over that time. He is currently at HEC University in Montreal, working on a program in reputation management with them. And we thought it would be good to bring Alan in and talk about his recent book that he just wrote, Reputation Matters, with the American Marketing Association Toronto chapter. At some point, Jonah will put in the chat a link to this if anyone wants to get a copy of the book. And in general, as we go, the chat has been shut down, but the Q&A is available. So if you have questions, please feel free to put your questions into the box, and we will follow up at the end. Alan, I am going to share my screen, and then the floor is yours. Let me just do this.
Okay.
Give me 1 second
That's
here.
that, and we can leave that very slide up.
We'll start with the title slide.
Okay.
And I will, let me know when you're ready to change your slide. And again, welcome everyone, and Dr. Middleton.
Thank you. And all the flattering stuff, you can go online to all my ex-students and they know it's not true. So I'll do what I can. But I want to tell you about where this comes from. We're going to talk about reputation. But this quote comes from a gentleman called David Mattin in the UK, who's a well-established consultant and writer and researcher. And back in 2017, he wrote the following. Quote, back in the day, business was a black box. For outsiders, it was pretty hard to see what was going on inside. The brand was painted on the outside of the box. People came and looked at it, and they either liked it or they didn't. Today, a business is a glass box. Outsiders can easily see inside. They can see the people and the process. They can see the values. They can even see what the people inside the box feel about what they are doing. And that's the world. He wrote that in 2017. Let's, on the next slide, look at what's happened to challenge reputation. And there's a number of various things that challenge people's reputation because of that glass box. The first is an obvious one, I think, which is poor, misleading, or illegal financial management. We're going to talk a little more about each of these through the session. The second and the fastest growing problem in reputation management is data misuse or data hacking by organizations. Third area is viral customer complaints for poor service or treatment. And by viral, we mean it may not just be a one-off thing, but if it happens with a regularity or frequency, it really begins to harm the reputation. Fourth area is a toxic organization culture or remuneration biases. In other words, not only are people not built as teams, they're not getting on, but there's still remuneration bias for no earned reason. This could be because of gender, it could be because of racial background, a number of areas. And the fifth area is a lack of clarity, communication, understanding, or training in ethical and compliance issues. Companies that may have policies based on some of the top four don't necessarily do a very good job telling people about it. In which case, unless you're in regular communication with employees on a day-to-day basis, they're not being helped make the decisions that lead to these bad challenges. So on to the next slide. One of the things we can talk about on the next slide is trust, because that's what we're all trying to build. And this is a quotation from a company called L'Oreal, based out of Paris, but global, a leader in the field and recognized as one of the great organizations that not only gets great returns, but practices to get these issues under control. And Emmanuel Lulin, who was their head of legal, but also their head of ethics and compliance issues, made the statement, trust is the currency of ethics. The more ethical you are and behave, the more you create trust. All organizations need the trust of employees, colleagues, and everybody in the organization. By a big lie, you can create short-term trust. But the issue is how you do it over time, and it must be measured by more than just compliance. In other words, you have to have your own ethical standards for the organization. And that's what Emmanuel Lulin has put in so successfully in L'Oreal. On to the next slide. So how do we do this? Well, we can start by thinking about how we think about our strategy. So the normal hierarchy, and apologies for those who went through this as part of MBAs or BBAs or undergraduate business or have seen this in lectures, all I've done is put in and add a little emphasis to some more. We need always to start with an organization. What's it there for? What benefit is it providing to a set of customers that delivers value to all its stakeholders? But the next in is the values. What do you bring to society and your organization? So that's where you start dealing with ethical issues of, for instance, reputation, that to do with the environment, to do with social needs, to do with governance needs, the ESG elements. Then on to the goals and the strategy. And then down, yes, thank you, down to the next there of setting in the resources, culture and structure, the tactics and the implementation. The key is that at the very senior level, you need to establish what your values are so it flows down into the rest of the activity for the organization. On to next slide. So Emmanuel Lulin created this and with the help of Mr. Boatwright, who wrote a book on ethics in financial services. And this should be a question we ask ourselves. Welfare, is anybody being harmed? And if so, can the harm be justified? And obviously you've got to be careful about that phrasing. Duty, what is our duty and obligation in that situation? Rights, are anybody's rights being violated? We're going to talk in a minute about privacy legislation that's gone a long way in Europe and is being discussed in Canada. Justice, is everybody being treated fairly or justly? Not only the obvious issues of gender and ethnic background, but also the issues of different departments and ways they're remunerated. Honesty, am I being honest in my actions? And then dignity, am I showing respect for all persons involved? On to the next one. So let's start with the 5 that we talked about. The biggest one, poor, misleading, or illegal financial management. And obviously the most famous case on this was Enron a few years ago, which had a lot of policies, but didn't do much about how it managed its financial management. And here you've got to go beyond compliance, what is strict legislation, to what you regard as ethical financial practice and reporting. Seek governance from organizations like, for instance, in Canada, the CPA, which has done a lot of work on ethics and compliance issues in financial services. and use board committees to supervise reports and approve audit appointments. Part of the responsibility of boards must be that you're looking at, are you sending out the fair information about your organization? So that's number one. Number two, data misuse. As I mentioned, this is the fastest growing area. And a lot of it is excessive data required or requested for fairly straightforward transactions. You look at the amount of data that's increasingly getting requested, and credit card data. Now, what everybody's trying to do is to pull in total data files on individuals. Now, where that results in better service, there may be appropriateness, but one of the things about privacy legislation that's upcoming is recognition of the risks of this. In fact, Tim Hortons back 2 years ago got fined for misuse of customer data. They had asked in a very passive way customers to give them data without suggesting how they were going to use it. Second area of data misuse is getting personal data from other than the individual. For instance, getting children to respond to data requests about themselves or their family. Anybody under the age of 16, what can you tell me about the parents? Third area, managing data derived for a specific purpose was reviewed without consent and built into other purposes. One of the issues here is healthcare records. And the data, there is no national standard of health records, but there are provincial. And there are evidence that with this danger of health records getting shared with other things, which obviously has huge impact on things like insurance and things like that. Fourth area, brand data used for personal benefit, where employees have access to the company benefit, are using it for their own benefit. Employees transfer brand data for their own personal use. On to next slide. Continuing data misuse. Ambiguity, when the request for data from the user is intentionally or unintentionally ambiguous. And this allows the broader use of the data than the provider, what you're providing, you're aware of. Misleading consent agreements. Big difference between what the literature now calls express consent and informed consent. You look at a lot of the legal and agreements that we get into to share data. You really look at it, a lot of it's too long, confusing, over legalistic, and basically allows the provider to do anything with it. The intent is often to confuse the individual or make it too time-consuming to be considered and cut off from the service. So the individual's always faced with access to relatively small product or service advantages by signing away what might be far too intrusive and access data. I did mention, so watch for Bill C-27, which is going through discussion in Canada, and they're modeling it on the extensive privacy legislation that's gone ahead in the European Union. The US is a long way behind on this stuff, so don't expect leadership in this issue from there. On to the next one. Poor customer service. Oh, no, everything's fine, right? You're all happy with the customer service you get from your organizations? No problems. What happened with Air Canada this week? They got in trouble because of mistreatment of handicapped passengers. So what this includes is service events that cause significant negative customer impact. Frequent repetition of the same or similar events. Sorry to pick on the airlines, but I'm going to just for a second. You know, how's your baggage being handled? Does it always get to the same place that you want to send it to? No reason. Here's the biggie. No reasonable explanation of why the bad service has occurred and given to the customers. This is dangerous for two reasons. It may mean that your organization doesn't know why it's happened and is not addressing a repetitive problem. But also, the evidence for, and there's research on this that says if an organization apologizes, explains, and shows that it's actually taking action on the problem, the complaint value from the individual goes down by about tenfold. So you can screw up service to somebody, but if you address it and do something about it, there's an upside for you. Lack of explanation, apology, as I mentioned, not providing suitable compensation. So when you get major problems that have happened, is there compensation in line with what the real cost to the individual customer has been? And then perceived on negative or price gouging. And a lot of it is going to go on this issue of where you put any taxes. Do you quote that outside the price? Do you quote extra services outside the base price? The notion in most countries is that the price you talk about should include all these things. On to the next one. The toxic workplace. And there's 4 charts on this, and I'm going to go through them fairly fast. But it's lack of attention to the values and culture of the organization by senior management and the board in policies and practice. In other words, the very policies of the place aren't addressing the culture of the organization in terms of how its employees are treated. Outdated employment practices that ignore diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. We're still a long way behind on defining what gets paid in a job, who can get hired. And we know one of the things that, again, research turns out, this isn't just guarding your reputation, it's doing better. Because diversity of viewpoint, where it's not based on unfair practices, tends to perform better in terms of the organization behavior. Mass layoffs and hires. Oh boy, look at the tech industry. And I put 22, 23. It's happening again this year. In this current age, why employ 20,000 to lay off 12,000 like 4 or 5 months later? What that sends out is a message about lack of planning, and certainly sends a message to your workplace that what you shouldn't be doing is looking for a career in this place. Let's deal with some more. Frequent conflicts between employees, both across and within functions. One of the things I spent my lifetime in marketing, but also with sales, and I was also struck by how often sometimes sales and marketing saw themselves as rivals, rather than they're both the 2 sides of the same coin. You add in the accounting department, you add in the production people. We know things do better when you form project management groups to solve issues. And part of what that does is begin to get people to respect for what each other do and reduce those frequent conflicts. Lack of cooperation we talked about. Frequent ongoing conflicts between employees and managers. Organizations who don't keep attention to how managers are treating their employees. Are they still treating them like the 20th and 19th century, like a bunch of slaves to do just what's on their job description and nothing else? That day is gone. We need to shift to more mentorship and more development of skills at every level in an organization. One of my joys in the past was to work with one of Canada's construction union leaders, who recognized that construction is always going to be a difficult industry for permanent employment. But what he could do is get employers to put in training programs so people could improve their skills, get people to share ideas across the different functions, whether it was supply management or actual delivery of it, getting people to work together and understanding each other. And just lack of communication. On to next slide. General lack of communication at any level. Let's keep our employees in the dark about what's going on, so they have to read it in social media, which I no longer know whether it's true or not, or the main media, in which case, why am I the last person to find out about it? There's far too much emphasis by organizations on what employees don't need to know. You're in a glass box these days, guys. You gotta let your employees know what's going on as much as you can. What employees then will do is they get over competitive with each other. If you're not given information about what they require, who they are, and what's going on, they recognize they have to compete with other people, and they hoard information rather than share it. Not only not good for the reputation of the organization, but not good in general. Employees feel they have to work constant overtime to retain their position. Look, some overtime is absolutely required. We're in a discussion about whether we do it, if for those of us who can, in the office or at home. Obviously, a lot of organizations can't do that. Is it 4 days a week? Is it 3 days? Is it 2 days? All these are legitimate discussions, but they're discussions about what it needs to do the job. And if the job is constantly and continuously ahead of people working reasonable amounts of overtime on a regular basis, then you need to rethink the job. On to the last slide on the toxic workplace. There are clear disparities in remuneration that seem to be based on age, gender, sexuality. You know, the old idea that seniority was the only measure rather than goal achievement. And goal achievement needs to be more than just financial. It needs to be some of the other things we've talked about as well. And that's where this needs to go, so that remuneration is not seen as biased in the organization. And the obvious one, last one, is failure to listen by management. Management does not want to hear about these issues. And, you know, you look at net promoter scores and things like that, but that's not adequate. You need to do a deep dive through research with people like Leger into what's happening in your organization. On to the next one, inadequate staff communication and training. What do we do about it? Well, you've got to start at the board of directors level. They need to understand and enthusiastically agree the importance of having clear mandates in this area. If all the board asks about is return on investment or KPIs, without having KPIs that relate to the overall health of the organization, you're in reputation vulnerability. Next slide. Having made a decision and developing policies, what you need to do is a strategy and stakeholder value committee, which should talk about how this gets the organization to get ethical practices into its behaviors. So this is at a senior management level. Next slide. And what we're doing then is, after that recommendation, the policies, both the board and the shareholders, should bring in employees as part of that discussion phase. So there's constant involvement by all the employees in these groups. And in writing them up, the language needs to be clear and user-friendly. In other words, don't get over legalistic about all this. Next slide. Communication of these policies should be done in person and training sessions. Here's one of the big issues. As I mentioned at the beginning, organizations that have got policies in these areas mostly do not do a good job at briefing people. So this needs to be done regularly. All new employees should understand this, but there should be review meetings. Life changes. Employees face issues where to do with all these 4 major points we discussed earlier that they need to ask questions about. So there needs to be an openness and a regular report back to all the staff on what is happening. The point is to have all organization staff living the positive culture of the organization and contributing to it. There will be a natural human bias to emphasize good reports, but the report should also be clear about what needs to change. So, you know, staff communication, board level drives senior management to set policies. Senior management engages all staff, representatives of all staff on the organization, to input to them as they write up the practices, which should be in understandable language and then regularly shared. Next slide. This increasingly, shareholders, governments, influencers, companies all want to know about not just the financial resources and the policies, but what are the values of the organization? And that's what we've been talking about. Next slide. So in branding strategy, because we're engaged in the marketing, here's a format that we talk about. First, let's talk about where it fits in external conditions. What is the competitive environment? Describe the marketplace and alternative sources that can be seen by the customer or the consumer, and the relative value your brand provides. Who is the target group? Use the research. That's why you need organizations like Leger and organizations like the AMA that recognize and emphasize to this day knowledge of potential customers is really important, with the caveat that you don't invade their privacy. Insight. What is the element that you know about the target group and what you can provide that founds your brand? Next slide. The internal conditions are things like the value system. What values the brand stands for? What benefits, the differentiating functional and emotional benefits. In other words, what is it the brand provides that's of benefit to the customer and the consumer relative to its competition based on the analysis of the previous page? What does the brand stand for and believe in? And this becomes an important element. What personality characteristics should the brand evoke? What reasons to believe? What proof do we offer? To be honest, I look at a lot of communication that goes on in different media, regular media and social media, and I'm going, yeah, that makes me feel good, but does it make me feel better than the competition? Is there any basis in there that make me feel about this brand better than this brand as a reason for being? So this becomes both a good use of the value system and ethics, but good basic brand strategy. And trust. What are we doing to deliver what we promise to the customer? In other words, if we can get that regular purchase, that repeat purchase system going, there people say, yeah, I hear flashy things about this new product, but yeah, no, I'm not going to go there because, you know, every time I want something for this brand, it's done it. So building the trust and the essence. On to the next stage. We're almost there. So before I do the 5 W's, though, I just want to pause and say, well, does this mean this reputation management, those 5 issues that hit us really hard, do they really damage organizations' finances and business? Let's ask the blunt question. And the answer is not in all circumstances. I would love to be able to tell you that by managing this and putting the money into this, the reputation fixes is going to save you and is going to cost you and will not be returned. Why? There's a clear difference between monopolies and oligopolies. Oligopolies being organizations with very few competitors, and an open market. In an open market, these things can kill you. It's that simple. A bad reputation where you've got lots of alternatives by other stores, other suppliers, other brands, can actually get rid of your brand. In an oligopoly where there's only a relatively few, the telecommunications market in Canada, to some extent the financial services market in Canada, organizations will suffer because of bad reputational management, but it may not be life-threatening over mine because are the others that different? And then secondly, you know, are they that bad? So you get that kind of discussion goes on. And with monopolies, obviously, you've got no choice. So I'd love to be able to tell you that what reputation management is about is saving your organization. And in some cases where there's open competition, it will be that. What it is in most cases is a weakening of your competitive thrust. So that's why it matters. So what do we do? And I put this down as the 5 W's. Start off with, what are our organization's values? How do these fit in with our organization's vision, mission, and goals, and with contemporary good ethical and compliance practice? How do these transfer into appropriately ethical and practical behavior by all members of our organization? And what costs do they care, and what do we do to fund them? So the question is, what are our values? Let's ask ourselves the question and go through the exercise of being clear about it. Why? Why is this important? Well, all board and organization personnel need to be aligned about the positive advantages of appropriate behavior. There's no point in going ahead with this if you have one department thinking this, one level of management thinking this, staff on the ground who are dealing with the customer or the consumer or suppliers on a regular basis, don't get rewarded for good practice and are not part of it. It's important that everybody in the organization has an understanding of what the values are and why they're important. Who? Who develops these policies? Answer: engagement by all departments. I spent on the last few slides how you go about it. It's got to be at board and senior management level, driving it, but with the active input of everybody in the organization. And it takes time. When I interviewed Emmanuel Lulin for the book on reputation management, when he was first appointed to move from the executive vice president of legal to exec vice president, legal, ethics, and compliance, the board said to him, when can I have the policies? And he said something to them that shocked them, but they agreed. He said, it's going to take 2 years. And they said, why? What? Can't you write the policies? You've been involved in this area before. And he said, no, I have to visit every one of our subsidiaries and interview people who do the jobs as well as the management. Then I'll come back from that process. And what I'll do is then I will develop the ethical and compliance policies and standards. There was a guy who understood what this is about. Yes, it takes time. It doesn't mean you do unethical things in the interim, but it means this is part of your strategic growth for the future. Next slide. Where? Where should the staff briefing and training take place? Where they are. You don't bring them into special sessions. It should be in their workplace, on the ground, as part of the DNA of the culture. And when the policies and practices should be implemented and briefed as soon as they're developed and briefing sessions are set up. We need to be doing this on a regular basis for the employees and for all members, and keeping up to date with what's going on in the world around us. On to the next slide. And there's the sum up. As was said by Benjamin Franklin, glass, china, and reputation are easily cracked and never well mended. Here's the overall point before we click off and go to questions. It's different now. You know, organizations are now, as I said, glass, not a box. And the reputation issues are spread so widely. Half the trouble organizations have, so let's talk about the value to the organization, is trying to manage the misinformation that's out there. Part of it is also making sure that they're doing the right things inside, so that when somebody contacts one of their employees who's just worked for them for 6 months and asks them the same question a media person is asking a senior manager, they get back similar responses because there's a shared belief, commitment, and training into what the organization stands for. I would say on a 1 to 10 scale, that if this kind of reputation is on a 1 to 10 scale, a 5 right now, within a very short period of time, it will grow to a 7, 8, or even 9 or 10 in free markets. Think in recent memory, just in the last couple of weeks. How do we feel about Air Canada these days, with how they treated a disadvantaged passenger online. Now, the airline industry may not allow you a realistic choice, but is that one of the 10th time you've heard about your treatment on Air Canada? What about Rogers, which has constant problems, for instance, going back when they fired people from CTV? What about Hockey Canada and all the recent issues there? You see how this is coming up now, and that's why this is important, and organizations need to pay attention to it as much as the KPIs of performance and ROI and shareholding. So, Dave, why don't we take some questions?
Thank you, Alan. I'm just going to stop sharing here and take a look at what we have. I just want to explore a little bit. You talked about how it's now a glass house. It's now something, but you've been doing this a long time.
I'm old.
I'm not saying that, but we're all there. A few decades ago,
Yeah.
there was other reputational issues, and businesses had technology and methods and practices that they had to adapt to that. So is this just the future coming together to make more issues, and it's just a different way? Like, are we better at managing reputation now than we were a few decades ago, or are we struggling to keep up with everything that's coming at us?
Yeah, good question. I think we're struggling. Even organizations that want to do the right things are struggling because there is a cost and an implication to this. And as I said, in oligopolistic and monopolistic situations, it's not clear cut. I mean, I'm sure there are some managers, I know nobody on this site will be feeling that, but there are some managers out there who say, oh, to hell with it. We get lots of complaints, but there's nowhere else for them to go, so we put up with it. That won't go away. What has happened since 2017, when the Glass versus Black Box was written, even in that less than 10-year period, you think about the information that goes out in social media, the information that other media is picking up on, the sensitivity in the marketplace as you get more and more pressure groups representing different interests, pressuring shareholders groups. So, how you manage your remuneration policies matters a lot. How you manage your hiring matters a lot. And this is getting into investors. So we're not just talking the ethical investors, we're talking the increase of concern about ethical behaviors by the regular investor, because they're beginning to realize the vulnerability. So I would say, as I said, move from a 5 out of 10 issue, it's up to a 6, and it's moving up to a 7 or 8 out of 10.
So how do business, I mean, obviously following the practices that you have in here helps businesses be better placed for the future. And one of the things you talked about, I want to re-emphasize, talking to everyone and making sure everyone understands the number of stakeholders that an organization can have. I go back to a research project on reputation we did for a client where there was 10 different stakeholder groups, and they didn't understand what was happening with their brand. There was a problem out there, and it came down to one, everyone got it except for one group. And it was like basically I understand where they misunderstood the brand concept of the organization, and they were able to change everything around. So I definitely see that as an issue. Absolutely. I want to go back to what you talked about in terms of you mentioned the Canadian market. We have Americans and Canadians on here. So for Americans that are here, apologies, we want to talk a little bit, but I think this applies to some organizations in the US where you have essentially oligopolistic organizations. And you talked about airlines, grocery stores. There's a perception of price gouging under the guise of inflation right now. In all of that, you could argue that the Canadian context, the importance and the impact of customer complaints, company values, internal management, etc., on corporate reputation may be overstated. Are Canadian consumers merely expressing their frustrations without affecting real change, resigned to a certain begrudging acceptance of substandard services due to a lack of alternatives? So if we're just complaining, Do
Yep.
these organizations ever have to really adjust or shift?
Yep.
Or is it just, or are we building up enough resentment that eventually it'll cause a problem? What do you think?
Um, Both of those,
Both of
actually.
that.
So,
Okay.
yeah, well said. Um, in an oligopoly situation in Canada, I'll come to the US in just a second. Um, the issue is no one or two things may hurt you, but the regular impact of these does, because even within oligopoly, and I'll use a Canadian example, BMO, Bank of Montreal, just got voted the best customer service bank. And this area. And they've got ads on television talking about that. I'm sure that's not going to have a direct, instant effect on their subscriptions and their sign-ups, but it will have, if they use it properly, an opportunity that used to, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be blunt about this, because the previous great customer reputation in the Canadian banking system was the TD. TD seems to have lost it to the BMO. And this did make a difference because people started seeing, and I know Leger did research on this, started seeing difference between the banks. We tend to think about our major banks as very similar, but there are differences that emerge. And so it may not be a big change, but these are moderate changes. And all the financial institutions have suffered that in the last year, those small changes and the impact on the bottom line. Over time, this affects you. Then let's not just forget, let's think about the customer. Let's think about the employees. The more an organization has a bad reputation for whatever reason, what kind of employees are going to go there? Will you have to pay more money in order to get somebody to come because they don't see it as a workplace to be engaged in? Or, more importantly, are the best employees going to startups or to other organizations? In other words, it's harming the ability of the organization to attract smart, well-mentioned new people.
Yeah.
So it affects that as well.
Yeah. And I'm going to use this as a blatant attempt to, or blatant uh, marketing of our reputation study. So you mentioned about how we've measured over time.
Absolutely.
Our reputation study is coming out in 2 months. We track hundreds of companies across Canada, looking at how well they're doing. And you talked about the banking institution. I mean, at one point, a little more than a decade ago, banks were all considered to have the same reputation in
Yep.
Canada, and TD with their comfy couch and the two older gentlemen complaining about bank open
Yep.
hours on their ads, they changed that narrative and they
Hmm.
changed that story till we and their employees and all their stakeholders believed that they had better service. And it's interesting to see that BMO is trying to take that
Absolutely.
approach and grow with it
Absolutely.
here. So I'm looking forward to seeing our results coming out
Yeah,
to see
it's a
how the
very good
banking
study. And
industry has shaped up, see how Air Canada has coming out in terms of reputation over the past year. So lots of, if anyone wants to learn about that, our website is available
and
to
also in the
see that.
book is a write-up on your study in 2023.
Excellent.
So
Thank you.
yeah.
Real fast. So other often organizations feel compelled. This is from Jeanette Hanna. Often
Okay.
organizations feel compelled to take a stand on social issues.
Yes.
How does this fit into reputation? And how do boards and CEOs
Uh,
navigate? When do I make that stand? When do I weigh in on issues?
okay. Firstly, I'm going to say something that may not be happy that you received. I like organizations that get involved in these issues, but I'm suspicious of them when it's just outside anything else to do with their practices. In other words, it's, oh, this looks like a good one. We can get some good reputation by doing this, but it doesn't change anything else we believe in. So I believe the right route for the future is, and for some organizations doing it now, is that what they support on an issue comes out of their practices as an organization and what they believe in. Now, that can be extended and should be extended. So that having been said, I like the fact they're doing it because an organization needs to stand for something.
Yeah.
And it's not just standing for what it produces as a product or a brand, but a contribution to the society it lives in. And let me add something which helps them in testifying with government, much more important than US. US, to bring the US in, We've just seen the interesting spectacle of the issue of what the major suppliers of digital communication, what responsibility they have for what appears on their sites and their messaging about discrimination and those issues. So we just saw them in front of government. Government's going to get more and more involved in this, even in the States. How do you get senior management boards in? It becomes part of that process of who is on your board and why are you there. So instead of boards should not manage. Boards should impact the aims and the goals of the organization. And being that partly is social as well as purely economic, you need people on your board recognizing that that becomes a key issue for them to push on. And as a group, they need to be committed in working with the CEO, who their primary role is the appointment of. Does the CEO have not only the performance history, not only the ability by judgment and leadership, but have they got this balance of ethical and commercial principles that we want to guide our organization? So that becomes a key issue for them. And then it's down the levels, as I said, that the policies get turned into real world practice and the feedback goes back. So part of it, the influence on the board and on the stock market as well, in general, not just the board, but the shareholders in general and the markets in general, that there's regular feedback of this reputational material. So people are asking the question.
So regular feedback, and I'm going to follow up on a couple of questions by Camille Wilkes and Edgar Baum here. Who owns the regular feedback? Who is responsible for making sure that that message? But first off, who owns this in the organization, and then who is responsible for making sure that feedback is constantly? Is it communications? Is it someone like who?
I think there's a difference between setting the policy and the practice and the supervision of it. The policy and the practice should be a senior executive committee of management. They may delegate the responsibility to getting it done to communications or HR or marketing. I don't mind who it is. But the point is, it's not just one siloed management's responsibility. Yeah. It's the senior executive committee's responsibility.
All right. So now an organization's decided to take your advice and make sure this is incorporated within. What sort of investment are we talking here from people, dollar, third parties brought in? Like, what does it take to bring something like this? You talk about L'Oreal and it's a
Yep.
2-year adventure, but that's not even, that's just the beginning of it. That's not the end of it.
Yep. No,
so what sort of investment does an organization have to be thinking about here?
I obviously can't give you a dollar figure.
Exactly.
But what I can give you is the process of learning about this is a process of learning about the health of your organization. So it's not just done for reputational issues, it's done for practice issues, because the more you understand the practices of the organization, what do people do when faced with awkward decision making? How do people behave? How do they get on with each other? All this is about an organization's health as well. So by and large, and I would say, particularly in the States, that the HR departments have been mostly charged with working in these areas, and with some that I know. In Canada, it's kind of developed like that. My nervousness about saying that, although I think that's because it's to deal with the people and the practice of the organization, that's why it's the HR people dealing with the other departments at a senior level. But it's got to be that they're looking for a general report on the health of the organization, and that's the value. So you're getting stuff back on, gee, we've set up that this department does this and this department does this. They're not talking to each other. How come? Well, maybe we shouldn't have it organized by department. Okay, bring in project management. How do we get project management to get people working across? And that's the change we're going through in organizations. And so one of my first books for the AMA was on mentorship, because I think mentorship is a powerful way done well in organizations of getting learning down without instructions down.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the discussion of the future.
Yeah, thank you. And the work that you're doing with AMA is fantastic. Thank you for that. As a business within the community,
Mm.
your book on mentorship was well received. I'm going to do another plug for you right now with the
Oh, yeah,
Reputation
okay.
Matters book. The link is in the
Thank
is
you,
in the
sir.
chat group if anyone wants
Yep,
it. And we're talking about your future book being on leadership and the
that's correct.
importance of that. And it all comes together as an organization,
Yeah,
especially in this the times that we're in right now.
yeah. I want to
I
go
think,
back to a question you asked earlier, David, which
yeah,
was about
sure.
the US relative to Canada.
Yeah,
Because the US is so ahead of Canada in so many ways. In technology, we tend to be slow adopters of technology. You know, we're a less individualistic culture and a less instant connection culture. But the US gets on with things really well. And in some areas, some of their insurance companies, for instance, some of their organizations that I've had the joy in dealing with, FICO, for instance, down in Texas, which begin to understand this, and they're looking for. FICO has put in an amazing mentorship program, recognizing the gap between the age of senior managers and the practices in technology of more juniors. Well, what they've got doing is some of their junior recent hires mentoring the senior managers on what's happening in technology.
yeah.
And it's that kind of thing that's a measure for the future. We got to create learning organizations that learn from one to other. And that is all part of learning about your reputation and how we work better together. The models we're using are back in the 18th and 19th century, old hierarchies, when we moved from the farm to the city and created hierarchies, telling people exactly what to do and kicking them out if we didn't like them or they did something wrong. What we've got to do is to stop doing that and start listening to each other.
Alan, I'm going to stop us on that because I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you very much for being part of our webinar today, for being
Thank
part of
you.
our academic committee, and for everything you do within the business sphere of our world, the marketing sphere. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. You will receive an email with the recording, with a copy of the slides. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we will continue to get those answered.
Big
Have a
thank you
great
to
day, everyone.
Leger. Big thank you to Leger. Big thank you to the AMA. And a big thank you to all who put up with me for the last hour.
Thank you again, Alan. Have a good
Take
day,
care.
everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.